I never expected to find out that my parents were federal criminals on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my architectural firm in the heart of the city, reviewing the blueprints for a new commercial plaza, when a small notification popped up on the corner of my monitor. It was an automated email from a real estate tracking website. I had set up the alert years ago when I first purchased my property in the mountains, simply to keep an eye on the market value of the surrounding neighborhood. The lake house was my sanctuary. It was a stunning 3-bedroom cabin built from dark cedar wood, sitting right on the edge of a pristine, quiet lake surrounded by dense pine forests. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 5 years to save the down payment. It was the first thing I had ever truly owned that felt completely mine, away from the demanding, chaotic orbit of my family. My parents, Margaret and Arthur, had never understood the concept of personal boundaries. For my entire life, they operated under the assumption that whatever belonged to me ultimately belonged to them. They were deeply entitled people who had spent their careers bouncing between failed business ventures and maxed-out credit cards, always expecting someone else to bail them out. That someone else was usually me. They heavily favored my older brother, David, who shared their aversion to hard work and their talent for spending money he did not have. Whenever I refused to fund David's luxurious lifestyle or pay my parents' debts, I was branded as the selfish, ungrateful daughter. I had strictly limited their access to the lake house after they threw a wild weekend party there 2 summers ago, completely trashing the hardwood floors and leaving a trail of broken glass on the patio. I clicked on the real estate notification, expecting to see a report about a neighboring property going up for sale. Instead, the email header read, "Congratulations on the sale of your property." I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. I clicked the link, which redirected me to the primary listing website for the mountain county. There, displayed in high resolution, were exterior photographs of my beautiful cedar cabin. The banner across the top of the image was bright red, displaying a single word: sold. Pending escrow. My heart skipped a beat, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting my chest. There had to be a mistake, a clerical error in the county system, or perhaps a glitch on the website. I had not listed my house for sale. I had not even spoken to a real estate agent. My hands slightly shaking, I minimized the architectural software and opened the official county clerk's portal. Because property transfers are public record, I only needed to type in my parcel number to see the recent filing history. The system loaded slowly, the little gray circle spinning on the screen. Finally, a new document appeared at the top of the ledger. It was a transfer of deed, filed exactly 4 days ago. I downloaded the PDF and opened it on my large monitor. The legal jargon blurred together for a moment before my eyes focused on the names listed at the bottom of the page. The document explicitly transferred the full ownership of the property from me, Evelyn Thomas, directly into the name of my mother, Margaret Thomas. Attached to the transfer was a secondary filing, a contract of sale between my mother and a wealthy couple from out of state, agreeing to a purchase price of $850,000. I scrolled back up to the transfer document, my breath catching in my throat. On the final page, right next to the notary stamp, was a signature. It was supposed to be my signature. It was written in blue ink, spelling out my full legal name. But it was not my handwriting. The loops on the letters were too wide, the pressure of the pen too heavy. I recognized that handwriting immediately. I had seen it on countless birthday cards and passive-aggressive notes left on my kitchen counter. It was my mother's handwriting. She had forged my signature. She had walked into a notary office, likely using some fabricated story or a fake power of attorney, and legally stolen my house right out from under me. And my father had clearly helped her orchestrate the sale, moving with terrifying speed to liquidate my sanctuary for nearly $1 million in cash. I sat frozen in my ergonomic office chair, the hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounding deafening in the quiet room. The betrayal was so absolute, so brazenly illegal, that my brain struggled to process the magnitude of the crime. They did not just ask for money this time. They did not try to guilt me into paying off a credit card. They had committed felony fraud, assuming that because I was their quiet, obedient daughter, I would never have the courage to involve the authorities. They thought I would cry, yell at them over the phone, and ultimately let them get away with it because they were family. I stared at the forged signature on the screen. The initial wave of panic and disbelief slowly began to recede, leaving behind something entirely different. It was a dark, icy clarity. They thought I was weak. They were about to discover exactly what happens when you mistake patience for submission. The first rule of surviving a sudden, catastrophic structural failure in architecture is to immediately evacuate the compromised zone. You do not stay inside a collapsing building to analyze why the beams gave way. You get out, you secure a safe perimeter, and you assess the damage from a distance. My compromised zone was my entire life in the city. If I went back to my apartment, there was a very high probability that my mother would show up unannounced. She had a habit of dropping by under the guise of bringing me Tupperware containers of terrible lasagna, but her real objective was always to snoop through my mail or ask for a temporary loan that she never intended to repay. I could not face her right now. If I saw her standing in my living room, acting like the loving matriarch while secretly holding the stolen deed to my sanctuary, I knew I would lose my temper. I would scream, I would accuse her, and I would give away the only advantage I currently held: the element of surprise. I stood up from my desk, closed my laptop, and packed it into my leather briefcase. I walked out of my glass-paneled office and approached my assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara. "Clara," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I need to cancel my afternoon site visits. Please clear my schedule for the rest of the week. Tell the clients I have a sudden family emergency." Clara looked up, her eyes widening slightly at my tone, but she nodded immediately. "Of course, Evelyn. Is everything all right? Do you need me to call anyone?" "No. Iraplia. I just need a few days completely off the grid. Do not forward any calls to my personal cell phone unless the building is literally on fire." I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage and got into my car. As I pulled out into the busy city traffic, I took my phone out of my purse and disabled the location tracking services. My family was notoriously invasive, and my brother David had once tracked my phone to a restaurant just to corner me and ask for money to fix his imported sports car. They were not going to find me today. I drove for an hour, heading away from the city center and toward the quiet, affluent suburbs. I pulled into the valet circle of a luxury boutique hotel hidden behind a thick wall of manicured hedges. It was the kind of place that catered to executives who valued absolute discretion. I checked in using a corporate credit card that my parents did not know existed. I requested a suite on the highest floor, at the end of the hallway, far away from the elevators. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped into the room, the silence was overwhelming. The suite was decorated in soothing tones of gray and slate, with heavy blackout curtains drawn over the large windows. I dropped my briefcase on the floor, took off my coat, and sat on the edge of the pristine king-sized bed. For the first hour, I did nothing but stare at the textured wallpaper. The emotional shock began to thaw, replaced by a profound, suffocating grief. It was a very specific type of mourning. I was not mourning the loss of the lake house. I knew I could get it back. I was mourning the final, undeniable death of the illusion that I had parents who loved me. Every child wants to believe that their parents have a line they will not cross. You can tolerate their selfishness, you can endure their favoritism toward your siblings, and you can even excuse their constant financial demands as a byproduct of their own poor choices. You build a wall of rationalizations to protect yourself from the painful truth. But forging my signature on a federal legal document to steal an $800,000 asset was a bulldozer driving straight through that wall. They did not see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource. And when the resource refused to freely give them what they wanted, they simply decided to take it by force, assuming I was too cowardly to defend myself. They were probably planning to use the cash to buy a condo in Florida, or worse, to fund another one of David's disastrous business ventures. I laid back on the bed and allowed the tears to fall. I cried for the little girl who had spent her entire childhood trying to earn the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I cried for the years of guilt trips, the ruined holidays, and the exhausting burden of being the only responsible adult in my family. But I am a very pragmatic woman. I do not wallow in self-pity for long. By the time the sun set, casting long, dark shadows across the hotel room, my tears had completely stopped. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was incredibly sharp. The grief was gone, replaced by the cold, calculated logic of an architect preparing to demolish a condemned structure. I stood up, walked into the marble bathroom, and splashed freezing water on my face. When I looked in the mirror, my eyes were red, but my expression was entirely devoid of warmth. My parents wanted to play real estate moguls with my property. They were about to learn that playing games with federal property laws was a fantastic way to end up in a concrete cell. I walked back into the bedroom, opened my laptop, and pulled up the directory for the State Bar Association. It was time to build my legal foundation. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. I ordered a black coffee from room service, dressed in a sharp, structured gray suit, and left the hotel. I was not going back to my architectural firm. I was going to the county records office. If I was going to build a legal case that would withstand the scrutiny of the federal authorities, a scanned PDF on a website was not going to be enough. I needed to see the physical documents. I needed to understand exactly how my parents had managed to bypass the strict legal protocols required to transfer real estate. The county clerk's office was located in a drab, concrete building in the center of the municipal district. I arrived just as the doors unlocked at 8 in the morning. I walked up to the front counter and requested the physical file for my parcel number, presenting my driver's license to the clerk. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with thick glasses, pulled a manila folder from a massive filing cabinet in the back and slid it across the counter. I opened the folder. Sitting right on top was the original transfer of deed. Seeing the forgery in person was entirely different than seeing it on a screen. The blue ink was pressed deeply into the thick paper, a desperate, clumsy imitation of my signature. But what truly caught my attention was the notary stamp located at the bottom right corner of the page. In order to transfer a deed, the signature must be notarized, meaning a state-licensed official must verify the identity of the person signing the document. I looked closely at the embossed stamp. The name of the notary public was clearly printed, Brenda Higgins. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Brenda Higgins was not a random professional. She was a woman who attended the same weekly country club luncheons as my mother. They had been playing tennis together for 15 years. The puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. My mother had not walked into a stranger's office with a fake ID. She had gone to her friend. She had likely told Brenda some fabricated sob story about how I was too busy with my architecture firm to come down and sign the papers, and Brenda, violating every rule of her license, had stamped the forged document as a personal favor. I turned the page, digging deeper into the file. The next document was the contract of sale. My heart rate spiked as I read the terms of the transaction. My parents had not just stolen the house. They were practically giving it away. The lake house was appraised at over $1.2 million. The contract of sale listed the purchase price at $850,000. They had listed it at a massive discount to guarantee an immediate, all-cash closing. They were desperate for liquidity. But why? My parents were financially irresponsible, but they were not currently facing bankruptcy. They had no outstanding mortgages that I was aware of. Why did they need nearly $1 million in cash, so urgently that they were willing to commit federal fraud? I flipped to the final page of the contract, which detailed the escrow instructions. This page dictated exactly where the buyer's funds would be wired once the sale was finalized. I read the receiving account information, and the air completely left my lungs. The funds were not going into my parents' joint checking account. They were being wired directly to a commercial business account registered to an LLC. The name of the company was Apex Innovations. I knew that company name. Everyone in my family knew that name. It was the tech startup my older brother, David, had been bragging about for the past 6 months. He had been trying to secure venture capital funding for a ridiculous app idea, but every legitimate investor had laughed him out of the room. He had been complaining endlessly at family dinners about needing seed money to get the project off the ground. I closed the manila folder, the coarse paper rough against my fingertips. The betrayal was not just about greed. It was about favoritism taken to a sociopathic extreme. My parents had looked at the sanctuary I had built with 5 years of my own blood, sweat, and exhausting labor, and they had decided to sacrifice it just to fund their golden boy's delusion. They were willing to make me homeless in the mountains just so David could play the role of a tech CEO in the city. They had stolen my property, forged my name, compromised a state notary, and brokered a fraudulent cash sale, all to hand David an $800,000 allowance. I thanked the clerk, walked out of the concrete building, and got back into my car. The morning sun was bright, but I felt freezing cold. The investigation was over. I had the motive, I had the method, and I had the proof. My mother thought she was a mastermind for getting Brenda to stamp a piece of paper. David thought he was finally going to be a millionaire. And my father thought they had pulled off the perfect victimless crime. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the most aggressive real estate litigator in the state. The time for crying was over. It was time to drop the hammer. I did not immediately drive to the lawyer's office. Instead, I drove to a large, quiet botanical garden on the outskirts of the city. I paid the entry fee, walked past the manicured rose bushes and the weeping willows, and found an isolated wooden bench facing a large, still pond. I needed a moment to breathe. I needed to let the sheer gravity of what I had just discovered settle into my bones, before I began tearing my family apart. Sitting on that bench, watching the ducks glide silently across the water, the final wave of grief finally caught up with me. It was not a loud, hysterical kind of sadness. It was a deep, aching hollow in my chest, a physical pain that made it difficult to draw a full breath. I realized, with absolute certainty, that I had been fighting a losing battle my entire life. I had spent 30 years trying to be the perfect daughter. I got perfect grades, I built a successful career in architecture, and I never asked them for a dime. I had subconsciously believed that if I just achieved enough, if I was responsible enough, they would eventually look at me with the same blind, unconditional adoration they reserved for David. But love, at least the kind of love my parents possessed, was not based on merit. It was based on utility and twisted dynamics. David was their golden child because he needed them, because his constant failures made them feel important. I was independent, which made me threatening. I was successful, which made me a target. I was not a daughter to them. I was a bank vault. And when the vault refused to open voluntarily, they felt completely justified in bringing a blowtorch to the hinges. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees and pressing my hands over my face. I let out a long, ragged exhale. Mourning the death of a parent is a terrible thing. But mourning the death of the hope that your parents will ever truly love you is a different kind of agony. It is a slow, agonizing process of letting go of a fantasy you have held onto since childhood. I sat on that bench and actively forced myself to let the fantasy die. I imagined all the childhood memories, the forced holiday dinners, the passive-aggressive comments, and the countless times I had bailed them out of trouble. I packed them all into a mental box, locked it, and threw it into the dark water of the pond. When I finally lowered my hands and looked back out at the water, the tears were completely gone. The hollow feeling in my chest had been filled with something much stronger, much colder. It was acceptance. I accepted that Arthur and Margaret Thomas were not my parents anymore. They were individuals who had committed a federal felony against me. They had conspired with a corrupt notary to steal an $800,000 asset, and they were planning to launder that money through my brother's shell company. They were thieves, plain and simple. And in the real world, you do not go to family therapy with thieves. You send them to prison. The empathy that had tethered me to them my entire life simply snapped. I felt a profound, terrifying sense of liberation. For the first time in my life, I did not care if I disappointed them. I did not care if I ruined their retirement. I did not care if David ended up bankrupt. They had declared war on me, assuming I would simply surrender. They had no idea that they had just activated the most dangerous version of me. I opened my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I had 3 missed calls and a text message from my mother. The text read, "Hi sweetie. Your father and I are taking a little weekend trip to the mountains. Hope work is going well. Love you." I stared at the screen, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. She was going to the lake house. She was going to my house, the one she had just illegally sold, probably to begin packing her things and celebrating her massive payday before the escrow closed. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. I typed a reply, keeping my fingers perfectly steady. "Have a wonderful time. Work is incredibly busy, so I will be tied up here in the city all weekend. Enjoy the fresh air. I hit send. I was not going to interrupt them. I was not going to call the local police and have them escorted off the property for trespassing. That was too small. That was too petty. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of real estate fraud, I was going to let them play all the way to the end. I was going to let them pack their bags. I was going to let them hire the moving trucks. I was going to let them taste the victory. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the wrinkles from my gray suit, and walked back toward the parking lot. The grieving daughter had entered the botanical garden, but she was not the one walking out. The architect was in charge now, and it was time to draw up the blueprints for their absolute destruction. There is a common misconception that healing from a profound betrayal requires a therapist, a comfortable couch, and endless hours of discussing your childhood trauma. For some people, that might be true. But I am an architect. I solve structural problems by analyzing the load-bearing walls and applying the correct amount of calculated pressure until the unstable elements are safely removed. My healing process did not begin in a therapist's office. It began on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper, sitting across from a man named Jonathan Sterling. Sterling was one of the most ruthless and expensive real estate litigators in the state. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for dismantling corrupt developers in court. I had hired him once years ago to resolve a zoning dispute for one of my commercial clients. He was brilliant, aggressive, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. He was exactly the kind of surgeon I needed to cut the cancer out of my life. I sat in his opulent leather chair and slid the manila folder across his expansive mahogany desk. I need you to review these documents, Jonathan, I said, keeping my voice completely steady. They were filed in the county records office 4 days ago. Sterling opened the folder, pulling out the transfer of deed and the contract of sale. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the legal jargon with practiced speed. It took him less than 2 minutes to absorb the details of the transaction. He looked up at me, his expression neutral. You sold your lake house in the mountains, he stated. Below market value, to an out-of-state buyer. Sterling let out a low whistle, slowly closing the folder. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. In his 30 years of practicing law, he had seen every variation of corporate greed, but the sheer reckless audacity of this family betrayal clearly stunned him. This is not a civil dispute over a property line, Evelyn, he said, leaning forward. This is federal real estate fraud. Because the buyers are from out of state, crossing state lines makes it wire fraud. Forging a deed is a felony. Colluding with a corrupt notary is a felony. If I take this to a judge right now, I can freeze the escrow account within an hour. The local authorities will arrest your parents by dinner time. I know, I said quietly, but I do not want you to freeze it today. Sterling raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. The closing date is scheduled for this coming Friday. If the escrow clears and the funds hit your brother's LLC, recovering the money becomes significantly more complicated. Why wait? Because if you freeze it now, my parents will claim it was a misunderstanding. They will say they had my verbal permission, or they will try to pin the blame entirely on the notary. They will scramble and try to play the victims, I explained, feeling a cold, satisfying clarity wash over me. I want them to fully commit to the crime, I continued. I want them to pack up their belongings. I want them to hire moving trucks. I want them to physically occupy the property, believing they have won, believing they have successfully stolen my life. I want the federal authorities to arrest them at the exact moment they think they are walking away with $1 million. Sterling stared at me for a long time. The confusion in his eyes was slowly replaced by a deep, profound respect. He recognized what I was doing. I was not just seeking legal restitution. I was orchestrating a psychological demolition. When is the moving day? He asked, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. Friday morning, I replied. They are planning to clear out the house right before the escrow closes at noon. Then we have exactly 3 days to prepare the ultimate welcome wagon, Sterling said, opening his laptop. I will draft the injunctions, and I am going to make a phone call to a colleague of mine in the white-collar crime division of the FBI. By the time your parents finish packing their boxes, the net will already be pulled tight. I walked out of Sterling's office feeling lighter than I had in years. The heavy, suffocating burden of being the responsible, unloved daughter was completely gone. The healing had officially begun, and the medicine tasted exactly like justice. A successful demolition requires more than just explosives. It requires perfect timing and the careful coordination of everyone involved in the blast radius. If you detonate too early, innocent bystanders get hurt. If you detonate too late, the target escapes. In this scenario, the innocent bystanders were the wealthy couple attempting to purchase my lake house. According to the forged contract, they were completely unaware that they were buying stolen property. If the escrow closed on Friday, they would wire $850,000 of their own money into my brother's shell company. While the federal government would eventually recover it, the process could take years, freezing their assets and ruining their lives. I was not going to let two strangers suffer just so I could get my revenge. I needed them to be part of the trap, which meant I needed an alliance. On Wednesday morning, sitting in my hotel room with a fresh cup of coffee, I pulled out the copy of the sale contract. I found the name and contact information for the buyer's real estate agent, a man named Toddy Vance, who worked for a high-end brokerage in the next county over. I picked up my phone and dialed his direct office line. Toddy Vance speaking, a deep, professional voice answered on the third ring. "Mr. Vance, my name is Evelyn Thomas," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and businesslike. "I believe you are currently representing the buyers in the pending sale of the Cedar Lake house on Pine Ridge Road." There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes, Ms. Thomas," Toddy replied, his voice slightly guarded. "I am familiar with the property. I have been communicating with your mother, Margaret, regarding the final escrow details. Is there an issue with the closing schedule?" "There is a significant issue, Toddy," I said calmly. "My mother does not own that house. I am the sole legal owner of the property, and I have never listed it for sale. The signature on the transfer deed you possess is a forgery, notarized by a corrupt official." The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute. I could practically hear Toddy's brain short-circuiting as he processed the information. In high-end real estate, a fraudulent deed is the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. "Ms. Thomas," Toddy finally said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "that is an incredibly serious allegation. My clients are preparing to wire nearly $1 million into an escrow account on Friday morning. If this is a joke, it is not funny." "It is not a joke," I assured him. "I am currently sitting with Jonathan Sterling, one of the top real estate litigators in the state. We have already initiated contact with the white-collar crime division of the FBI. My parents are attempting to defraud your clients to funnel the money into my brother's tech startup." I heard Toddy curse softly under his breath. He was a professional, and he instantly realized the liability nightmare he was stepping into. If his clients wired the money into a fraudulent account, his brokerage would be buried in lawsuits for a decade. "What do you need me to do?" Toddy asked, his tone shifting from defensive to entirely cooperative. "Do you want me to cancel the escrow immediately? I can have my broker stop the wire transfer within the hour." "No," I said sharply. "Do not cancel the escrow. If you cancel it now, my parents will panic. They will know they have been caught, and they will run. I need them to believe the sale is proceeding exactly as planned." Toddy sounded bewildered. "But if the sale proceeds, my clients lose their money. I cannot allow that to happen, Evelyn. I have a fiduciary duty to protect them. I am not asking you to risk their money," I explained patiently. "I am asking you to delay the wire transfer. On Friday morning, when my parents arrive at the lake house to move their things out, I need you to assure them that the funds are in transit. Tell them the bank is processing the wire. Tell them the escrow is finalizing. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to keep them on the property. Keep them waiting for a payday that is never going to arrive." "Oh," Toddy murmured, a note of dark amusement creeping into his voice. "You want to keep them on the stage until the curtain drops." "Exactly," I said. "By the time they realize the money is not coming, the federal authorities will already be in the driveway. Your clients keep their money, you protect your brokerage from a massive lawsuit, and the people attempting to scam you end up in handcuffs. Do we have a deal?" There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of a pen clicking on a desk. "Evelyn," Toddy said smoothly, "it would be my absolute pleasure to coordinate this delay. I will speak with my clients confidentially. Your parents will not suspect a thing until the red and blue lights are flashing in their rearview mirrors. I hung up the phone, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. The alliance was secured. The inside man was in position. My parents thought they were orchestrating a brilliant financial heist, but they were actually just walking blindly into a perfectly constructed, inescapable vault. A trap is only as effective as the mechanism that triggers it. If the mechanism is faulty, the prey escapes, and you are left standing empty-handed. In the realm of federal law, the mechanism is not emotion or circumstance. It is incontrovertible forensic evidence. Jonathan Sterling had promised to pull the net tight by Friday, but a litigator of his caliber does not rely solely on a client's word. On Wednesday afternoon, he arranged an emergency meeting at his downtown office with a forensic handwriting analyst named Dr. Eris Thorne. Dr. Thorne was a retired federal agent who now consulted for private firms. He was meticulous, quiet, and carried a briefcase filled with high-resolution scanners and digital measurement tools. Sterling and I sat in the conference room as Dr. Thorne examined the physical copy of the forged transfer deed that Sterling's paralegal had retrieved from the county clerk earlier that morning. We provided him with 10 verified samples of my actual signature, spanning the last 5 years, along with several birthday cards and handwritten letters I had saved from my mother. Dr. Thorne worked in absolute silence for nearly an hour. He scanned the documents, blowing up the signatures on a large presentation screen, measuring the angles of the cursive loops and the pressure points of the ink. When he finally turned off his equipment and sat back down, his expression was grim. "It is a forgery," Dr. Thorne stated, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of an expert witness. "And frankly, it is a very sloppy one." The author of the fraudulent signature attempted to mimic the general shape of Evelyn's handwriting, but the muscle memory is completely different. The pen pressure is too heavy on the ascenders, and the spacing between the letters is inconsistent. He clicked a button on a remote, highlighting a specific loop on the screen. Furthermore, he continued, when we overlay the forged signature with the known samples from Margaret Thomas, the structural similarities are undeniable. The way the T is crossed, the subtle hesitation at the end of the final letter. It is a 99.9% match to Margaret's baseline handwriting. She did not just facilitate the forgery. She physically held the pen. Sterling nodded, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "Excellent. And what about our corrupt notary public, Brenda Higgins?" "I had my investigative team run a deep background check on Ms. Higgins," Sterling said, turning to me. "It turns out her stamp is legitimate in this state, but she had a previous notary license permanently revoked in Nevada 12 years ago for, you guessed it, failing to properly verify signatories on real estate documents. She has a documented history of professional negligence." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the sheer volume of evidence stacked on the table. My mother had forged the document. Brenda Higgins had illegally stamped it. And my father had brokered the sale to an out-of-state buyer to fund David's LLC. The conspiracy was perfectly documented, sealed with forensic certainty and a trail of digital paperwork. Sterling picked up a thick binder from his desk and slid the forensic report inside. He closed the binder with a heavy, satisfying thud. "I have a meeting with Special Agent Miller from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division in 1 hour, Sterling said. They are already highly interested in this case due to the dollar amount and the fact that the wire transfer crosses state lines, making it federal jurisdiction. With Dr. Thorne's forensic analysis and the background check on the notary, they have everything they need to secure the arrest warrants." He looked across the table at me, his sharp gray eyes completely focused. "The local sheriff's department has been notified to assist the federal agents," Sterling continued. "They will set up a perimeter around the lake house early Friday morning. Toddy Vance will keep your parents distracted with updates about the pending wire transfer. When the clock strikes noon, the trap will snap shut." I walked out of Sterling's office and drove back to my hotel room. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the city skyline. I felt no anxiety, no lingering sadness, and absolutely no guilt. I had simply gathered the raw materials of their own actions and built a mirror for them to look into. If they did not like the reflection staring back at them, that was no longer my problem. The evidence was undeniable. The federal authorities were briefed. The warrants were being signed. All that was left to do was wait for the enemy to make their final mistake. Arrogance is a fascinating psychological blind spot. When narcissists successfully execute a manipulation, they are rarely satisfied with simply getting away with it. They feel a deep, compulsive need to flaunt their perceived superiority over their victim. They want to stand on the edge of the cliff and wave down at the person they just pushed off, entirely unaware that the person at the bottom is holding the detonator to the bridge they are standing on. It was Thursday evening, the night before the scheduled closing. I was sitting at the small desk in my hotel room, reviewing some architectural blueprints to pass the time, when my cell phone vibrated across the polished wood. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, steadying breath to ensure my voice betrayed absolutely no emotion. I pressed answer and put the phone on speaker, resting it on the desk next to my laptop. "Hi Mom," I said cheerfully. "Is everything all right?" "Oh, everything is just wonderful, sweetie." Margaret's voice floated through the speaker. She sounded almost breathless with excitement. "Your father and I are up at the lake house. The sunset over the water is just stunning this evening. We were just having a glass of wine on the patio and thinking of you." "I am so glad you are enjoying it," I replied smoothly. "The patio is beautiful this time of year." "It really is," she agreed. "You know, Evelyn, I was doing a little bit of cleaning in the guest room today. I found a box of your old college textbooks and some of those architectural sketches you used to do. I figured you did not need that old clutter anymore, so I just tossed them in the dumpster out back. I hope you do not mind. We just needed to clear up some space." My jaw tightened. Those sketches were from my senior thesis, completely irreplaceable hand-drawn drafts that I had stored in a sealed box in the closet. She had thrown them in a dumpster simply to clear out the house for the new buyers, framing it as a casual favor to mask her cruelty. "It is fine, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly indifferent. "I have digital copies of the important things." "Good," she said dismissively. "Oh, hold on. Your brother is here. He wants to say hello." David was there. Of course he was. The golden boy had driven up to the mountains to celebrate the incoming wire transfer with his benefactors. "Hey, Evie," David's voice boomed through the speaker, thick with unearned confidence. "Mom says you are stuck in the city working all weekend. Sucks to be a corporate drone, right?" "Someone has to design the buildings, David," I replied mildly. "How is the startup going?" David laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound that grated against my ears. "The startup is about to explode, Evie. We are actually closing a massive round of seed funding tomorrow morning. Close to $1 million in liquid capital. I am going to be running a tech empire by the end of the year. You should probably be nice to me. I might hire your firm to design my new corporate headquarters." "That is incredible news, David," I said, staring at the blank wall of the hotel room. $1 million is a lot of money to secure in one day. You must have put together a very convincing presentation." "I did not have to do much presenting," David bragged. "Some investors just recognize raw talent when they see it. Anyway, we are about to pop some champagne to celebrate. Do not work too hard, little sister." He handed the phone back to my mother, who offered a few more hollow pleasantries before hanging up. The silence returned to the hotel room, thick and heavy. I picked up the phone, staring at the darkened screen. They were standing in my living room, drinking wine on my patio, throwing my personal belongings into a dumpster, and mocking my career, all while waiting for the stolen cash to hit David's bank account. They were completely, dangerously intoxicated by their own greed. A year ago, a phone call like that would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and frustration. I would have spent the entire night wondering why my hard work was constantly belittled while David's delusions were fiercely protected. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing. Their insults were completely meaningless because they were delivered by ghosts. The family that had tormented me for 30 years ceased to exist the moment they forged my signature. They wanted to pop champagne and celebrate their raw talent. I was going to let them enjoy the hangover. I turned off my phone, closed my blueprints, and went to sleep. Tomorrow was moving day. Friday morning arrived with a clear, crisp sky and the sharp scent of pine in the air. I checked out of the luxury hotel shortly after breakfast, dressed in a comfortable but structured black trench coat, and began the long drive up into the mountains. I did not drive all the way to the lake house. Instead, I pulled onto a secluded, elevated dirt road that ran along the ridge directly above my property. Through the thinning autumn trees, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the cedar cabin, the expansive wooden deck, and the long gravel driveway leading up to the front door. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and rolled down the window. Down below, the scene was exactly as I had anticipated. A massive, commercial moving truck was parked in the driveway, its rear doors wide open. Two professional movers were hauling heavy pieces of furniture out of the front door and loading them into the truck. I watched through a pair of compact binoculars as they carried out my custom-made oak dining table, followed by the expensive leather sectional I had purchased just last year. My parents were not only selling the house, they were stealing the furniture to furnish whatever new luxury condo they planned to buy with the stolen funds. David was standing on the front lawn, dressed in a designer tracksuit, holding a clipboard and aggressively directing the movers as if he were a foreman on a construction site. My mother, Margaret, was pacing back and forth on the deck, her cell phone pressed tightly to her ear. "Excellent," Sterling said. "Toddy Vance is doing a phenomenal job on his end. He just called your mother to inform her that the buyers have authorized the release of the funds. But there is a mandatory federal compliance hold on the wire because it exceeds $500,000. He told her the bank just needs an extra 45 minutes to clear the fraud check." I smiled, a genuine cold smile. It was a brilliant stall tactic. It kept them anchored to the property, absolutely convinced that the delay was a standard bureaucratic hurdle rather than the sound of the trap closing. "They are going to wait," I told Sterling. "David is probably refreshing his banking app every 30 seconds. We will hold position until 12:45, Sterling confirmed. "That gives them enough time to finish packing the truck and get comfortable. When they are ready to drive away, we drop the net." I ended the call and leaned back against the leather seat, keeping the binoculars raised to my eyes. The next hour passed in a state of excruciating, delicious tension. I watched my mother pace faster, clearly growing agitated as noon came and went. She called Toddy Vance 2 more times. I could tell by the angry, frantic gestures she was making toward the sky. Toddy, playing his role perfectly, likely assured her that the compliance hold was almost lifted. Down on the lawn, David was staring obsessively at his phone. He looked up, shouted something at the movers, and then went back to violently tapping his screen. He was so close to his unearned tech empire, he could practically taste it. He had no idea he was standing on a financial landmine. At 12:40, the movers finally pulled the heavy metal doors of the truck shut and locked the latch. My parents and David gathered near the front porch. Arthur locked the front door of the cabin, turning the key with a finality that made my blood run cold. He truly believed he was locking the door on my life forever. My mother checked her phone one last time, a massive, triumphant grin suddenly breaking across her face. Toddy had just given her the final green light. He had told her the compliance hold was clear. She turned to David and hugged him, jumping up and down. David threw his hands in the air, cheering like he had just won the lottery. They began walking toward their luxury SUV parked behind the moving truck, ready to drive away as millionaires. My phone vibrated again. It was a single text message from Sterling. "Green light." I lowered the binoculars and watched the bottom of the gravel driveway. A few seconds later, the silence of the mountain air was shattered by the deep, aggressive roar of heavy engines. 3 black, unmarked federal SUVs turned off the main road and accelerated up the gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Right behind them, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 county sheriff cruisers cut through the afternoon shadows. The legal fortification was complete. The enemy had just realized they were surrounded. The federal vehicles did not just park in the driveway. They executed a perfectly coordinated tactical blockade. The 3 black SUVs swerved sharply, cutting off the front and rear of the moving truck, while the sheriff cruisers blocked the exit behind my parents' luxury vehicle. I watched through the binoculars as my mother froze, the triumphant grin melting off her face, replaced instantly by a mask of pale, absolute terror. 5 men wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed across the back stepped out of the SUVs. They did not draw their weapons, but their posture was aggressive and entirely uncompromising. The local deputies stepped out of their cruisers, standing by the perimeter to ensure nobody attempted to run. I started my car, shifted into gear, and began the slow drive down the ridge toward the lake house. I wanted to see the final act up close. By the time I pulled into the edge of the driveway, Special Agent Miller was standing directly in front of my parents. I rolled down my window and listened to the glorious sound of federal justice. "Margaret and Arthur Thomas," Miller announced, his voice carrying easily over the mountain wind. "You are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and the criminal forgery of real estate documents." My mother immediately began to shake, her hands flying up to her chest in a gesture of exaggerated innocence. "Officer, there is a massive misunderstanding here," she shrieked, her voice pitching up an octave. "We did not commit fraud. We just sold this house. We have the paperwork. My daughter gave us permission." Miller did not even blink. "We have a sworn statement from your daughter, a forensic handwriting analysis confirming you forged her signature, and a recorded confession from the notary public, Brenda Higgins, who was arrested at her home 20 minutes ago." My mother's legs gave out, and she practically collapsed against the side of the moving truck. My father looked like he was having a heart attack, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as a federal agent pulled his hands behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. David, who had been completely silent during the initial raid, suddenly took a step backward toward the tree line. Agent Miller pointed a finger directly at his chest. "David Thomas, you are the sole proprietor of Apex Innovations, correct? The entity designated to receive $850,000 in stolen funds?" "I did not know," David screamed, holding his hands up. "I swear to God. I thought they sold their own house. I have nothing to do with this." "You can explain that to the federal judge at your arraignment," Miller said coldly. "Put your hands behind your back." As a deputy stepped forward to handcuff my screaming brother, I opened my car door and stepped out onto the gravel. The crunch of my boots drew my mother's attention. She looked up, her tear-streaked face contorting into an expression of pure shock as she realized I was not in the city. "I was here. Evelyn," she wailed, straining against the agent holding her arms. "Evelyn, please. Tell them it is a mistake. They are going to put your father and me in jail. We are your family." I walked slowly toward her, stopping a few feet away. I looked at the handcuffs cutting into her wrists. I looked at David, who was currently crying uncontrollably against the hood of a sheriff cruiser. Then I looked at the moving truck, filled with my stolen furniture. "You stopped being my family the moment you forged my name," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough ice to freeze the air between us. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was just a bank vault you could crack open whenever David needed cash. But you forgot one very important detail, Margaret." I leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the woman who had tormented me for 30 years. "I am an architect," I told her. "I build things that last. And the prison sentence I just built for you is going to last a very, very long time." I turned my back on her before she could respond. I walked over to the foreman of the moving crew, who was standing by the truck looking absolutely terrified. "I own this house," I told him, handing him a $50 bill from my purse. "Please put all of my furniture exactly where you found it." The aftermath was swift and devastating. Federal prosecutors do not offer lenient plea deals when there is forensic evidence of wire fraud crossing state lines. My parents were sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. David, convicted as an accomplice, received 3 years and the permanent destruction of any future career in the tech industry. Brenda Higgins lost her license and went to jail for 5 years. I kept my lake house. The quiet was finally mine. Lessons from this story. First, greed is a blinding force. When entitled family members believe they own your success, they will easily rationalize committing federal crimes, mistakenly believing that their status as your family will shield them from the law. Second, the immense power of delayed gratification and revenge. If I had confronted them immediately, they would have scrambled and hidden the evidence. Letting them pack their bags and fully commit to the illusion of victory made their inevitable downfall infinitely more devastating. Finally, tears and emotional manipulation hold absolutely zero weight against notarized documents and forensic analysis. When dealing with narcissists, do not argue with them. Simply build an airtight legal vault, Let them walk inside and lock the door.